Well, welcome to this week's Community Focus. I'm your host, Jaden Jefferson. Joining me today is Dr. Melissa Miller, Professor of Political Science at Bowling Green State University. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, there was a new poll that just came out conducted by BGSU, and it looked at the gubernatorial race as well as some of the things happening on the federal level. So, let's first just start out with the federal level, of course, because a lot of news making actions there with regard to the federal government and how it's currently being reshaped. So, what are Ohioans thinking about all of this, keeping in mind that Ohio went for President Trump for all three campaigns?
That's right. Trump won the state by 8 points in both 2016 and 2020, and then widened that, winning by 11 points in 2024. What's surprising with the results from the April BGSU YouGov poll is that despite our poll being a good reflection of that 2024 electorate, our poll shows Trump plus 10, very close, virtually the same as his plus 10, plus 11 rather, victory in Ohio. There's some signs of trouble for the Trump administration. If you look amongst all voters, Trump is now underwater, if you will. So he was plus 7 in February, the last time we polled, in terms of his job approval, and now he's -1. So some slippage there in terms of approval. And I think one of the most interesting things is that if you just look at the independents in our poll of 800 Ohio voters, he's underwater by 7 points in terms of that job approval. So I think Ohio turns out to be kind of an important place to look. Jaden, your listeners, your viewers will know there's been a ton of 100 days reporting and lots of national polls that come out. But the national polls, I think, are not really what ought to be the focus, because we don't elect a president nationwide. And those polls are being influenced, those national numbers, which poll after poll has shown aren't so good for President Trump at the 100-day mark. Those include voters from California and Massachusetts and other really liberal states. So I think looking carefully, particularly at the independent vote in Ohio, is important to do. And like I said, our poll finds that he's underwater among Ohio independents.
And independent voters swing the election each year. So, of course, it's important to keep that in mind because they're the voters that you're trying to win. So, that's definitely an important thing to pay attention to, but particularly on the economy, because this has been an issue that the president, he did well with on his first term. But now in the second term, with the widespread tariffs that we've seen, there's certainly been some economic uncertainty. And is that being reflected in the Ohio poll?
Absolutely reflected among Ohio voters. So, kind of like the national polls, when you drill down, what you find is that there was actually support for the tariffs on China, but we were tracking our February poll, and so that slight majority support for a 10% tariff on China reflects what the policy was back in February. And now the effective policy on China is 145%. So even though it might appear, oh, Ohioans are comfortable with this across the board tariff on China, that's not where we are in terms of policy. So I wouldn't, if I were Republicans in the Trump administration, I wouldn't take too much heart in the fact that the support among Ohio voters for China's tariffs on China was majority support, because it was only at the 10% level. We saw majority opposition to the 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada. And looking broadly, just taking a broad view of the 19 different policy issues that we tested, there was majority support amongst Ohio voters on only 3 of those policies. And so that is just not very much. And to give you an example, one of them was the executive order that provides federal recognition for only 2 sexes, male and female. In other words, when you get into tariffs, there isn't that kind of resounding support, far from it in Ohio, of the Trump tariff policy. And I think that that will get the attention and ought to get the attention of Republicans.
And we see, of course, happening simultaneously with all of this kind of confusion on the national level regarding what those next steps are going to be with regard to tariffs. We're seeing that we have a gubernatorial race here in Ohio. And of course, Ohio Republicans tend to do well when they ride the wave of Trump. And we're seeing that one of the people who has done that successfully in recent time has been Vivek Ramaswamy. He was expected to be serving in the Trump administration alongside Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency efforts, but he stepped down from that position and is making a run for Ohio governor. What is the poll showing about him in particular? Because it seems that he's definitely got in the lead.
So we partitioned our 800 respondents by asking them if they were likely to vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. So looking just among Ohio Republican primary voters in 2026. Vivek Ramaswamy is far and away over 6 in 10 Ohio primary voters say that if the election, that primary were held today, they would vote for him. And far behind are Jim Tressel and Dave Yost. The lieutenant governor and the attorney general, respectively, and they're tied at about 13-14% apiece. So I think Vivek Ramaswamy is really benefiting from two things. One is, as you mentioned, his association with the Trump administration. And secondly, just from the name recognition, he's going to be way ahead on that simply by virtue of the fact that he ran for president in 2024. And while not, of course, winning the Republican nomination, really made a name for himself at the national level, and we're seeing that reflected. So the campaign hasn't really even started yet. So I do think that Ramaswamy is riding on name recognition and his association with the Trump administration. There really isn't a campaign yet. I don't know that he would stay that far ahead, but things certainly look good for him heading into the governor's race, which, right, it's, starting,
2026.
it won't be long, and there will start to be some campaigning for that.
What I found interesting when you polled Democrats in this poll was in terms of who they thought they would like to see run for governor. Currently, Dr. Amy Acton is running on the Democratic side, and she's the only Democrat who's declared they're running for governor. But Democrats really like Senator Sherrod Brown, who lost re-election to the U.S. Senate this year to Bernie Moreno. Was that something that surprised you, or was this to be expected from Ohio Democrats?
I think it was to be expected from Ohio Democrats because Sherrod Brown has held federal office for so many years, first
Yeah.
as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and then more recently in multiple U.S. Senate terms. So he did lose back in November, but he, amongst the possible Democratic candidates, certainly enjoys the widest name recognition. As you said, Dr. Amy Acton was perhaps a household name back in 2020 as the top health official for the state of Ohio, appearing daily in the COVID briefings that Governor DeWine held. But she's really been out of the picture. We also tested Tim Ryan, the former congressman from Northeast Ohio, who lost his bid for U.S. Senate. Um, he is also pretty far behind Sherrod Brown. So we'll see. Tim Ryan, for instance, has not declared. Sherrod Brown has not declared. So we'll see what happens in that race, but I think Sherrod Brown would bring a lot to the table.
And certainly what has happened with Ohio politics is there used to kind of be this middle where you would have a Senator Sherrod Brown and a Senator Rob Portman just sharing the Senate simultaneously. And so has the state kind of just shifted in that way in which there really isn't a middle in Ohio?
Well, I think one of the things I just have to point this out. So that's a long term in terms of a Democrat and a Republican simultaneously holding seats, right? So you can go further back and U.S. Senator John Glenn and Howard Metzenbaum. I mean, it was kind of a long history. I think certainly the national media consider that Ohio is now a red state. But I would say this, an 11% Trump victory in Ohio in 2024. That's not nearly as big as some really deep red, long-standing states. Now, one of the key questions is which way will the independents swing? And they've been swinging in a conservative direction in recent years. But I think digging into those numbers amongst independents, particularly if you look at 2026, Donald Trump won't be on the ballot. And going forward after that, Donald Trump won't be on the ballot. And so one of the questions is, will independents lean, it sort of revert to really being more sort of the middle, sometimes going to the Democrat, like in the case of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, sometimes going for the Republican in the case of George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush and Donald Trump. So I think we want to get some distance on these trends and then reconvene.
Yeah, and some might say it's early to think about 2028, but I don't think it's ever too early to do that because a lot of the groundwork is being laid for 2028 now because campaigns are run based on change oftentimes. And if there is a Democrat who feels strongly opposed to the Trump administration and is gaining that support, they're doing that work now. What would you say about Ohio? What are the issues that Ohio voters are saying they want to hear about currently and maybe aren't hearing about as much?
Our BGSU YouGov poll clearly indicates that Ohio voters care most deeply about inflation and the economy. And then to a lesser extent, around less than a quarter, are saying that the most important issue is threats to democracy. But you sort of combine that, and boy, you get a solid majority of these are the concerns of Ohio voter. And one and two are inflation and the economy with democracy, threats to democracy coming in third. And one of the things you pointed out earlier, Jaden, is that a lot of these policy changes are just going to begin to get underway now. The fact that we're beginning already to see some evidence in the polls that Ohioans are not necessarily thrilled with the direction that the country is going, particularly in terms of tariffs and economic policy. It may get better before it gets worse, in terms of the poll numbers, in the sense that people are already feeling concerned about what's to come in terms of gas prices and prices at the grocery store and, you know, the price of a new car or even a used car. All of these things are expected to go up. And I think you're right, though. I think that Donald Trump's base, they will be with him. They are very, very committed. So it all comes back to those independents. And like I said, according to our April data, our 100 days poll of 800 Ohio voters, the independents within that sample are already feeling the jitters.
And we even have coming up sooner in 2026, not only the governor's race, but the midterms. And in the Toledo area, we have a district that is going to be very close based on this last election, which I believe was decided by less than 3,000 votes. And of course, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur is expected to run for reelection. And then you'll have Republicans who may have someone else running against her. There are some candidates who've already declared, but what should we look for in terms of those kinds of races where you have a longtime Congresswoman and you also have a Republican opposition that wants to be in that seat?
That particular district was redrawn in order to be more favorable toward Republicans. And you could almost see mathematically it did get a lot closer. As you say, it was decided by such a narrow margin with Democratic incumbent Marcy Kaptur retaining her seat back in November. Next year, what we see both in the House and Senate, and we'll have both congressional races with all of Ohio's U.S. House seats up for reelection, as well as a U.S. Senate seat, because, of course, Ohio has to fill on a permanent basis the seat that was occupied by now Vice President J.D. Vance. But I think a couple of things. One is both the U.S. House and Senate are so closely divided. And there are very few toss-up races across any thinking just about 435 House districts, there are so few that are thought they could be a toss-up, and Marcy Kaptur's district is one of them. So I think there will be a lot of attention paid to that election. I think the Republicans are no doubt trying to recruit a really quality candidate, thinking that's a seat that they ought to be able to win. She has proved very resilient. including in this most recent November election. But I think there will be a race that will get a lot of attention. I think without a doubt it's going to be close, almost whoever the Republicans put on at the top of that ticket for that US House seat.
And certainly it's going to also come down to those issues that matter most to voters because the biggest thing that voters wanted done after 2024's election was lower prices and they wanted things to be affordable again. If they're not seeing that, and we're already seeing this now, cracks are going to start to show, and those cracks are starting to show.
Yes, and the other thing I think that the president ran on, and I will mention this about the polling numbers just to touch on one other issue that Ohioans tended to be supportive of, was the declaration of a national emergency at the southern border. And so Ohioans were very supportive of that. That's true also among Ohio independent voters. But here's the thing, in 2 years' time, in 4 years' time, particularly if the southern border doesn't go to crisis proportions again, and the indications are that it won't. I mean, that is where the border is a lot quieter than it has been, and Americans in our poll and in national polls are suggesting that they're pleased with some changes at the border. They do not necessarily tend to have that be their most important issue.
Yeah.
And certainly in 2 years' time, for instance, in 2026, in those US House races, and including the race Marcy Kaptur will no doubt be in, that will no doubt be close. I don't know that immigration is going to be a top issue. I think pocketbook issues time and time again in political science research and national polls and statewide polls and our own polls show that pocketbook issues tend to be king when it comes to the factors that influence how people vote.
And certainly that is a factor that is closer to home because for Ohio voters, it's something that the issue of the border is something that's very far away, where when your pocketbook is close to you. And we've seen that
That's right.
some negative PR surrounding the mistaken deportation of a man from Maryland, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And that story certainly has gotten a lot of coverage.
Absolutely. And people do identify it as an important problem, but I think one of the differences between issues such as immigration and the high profile detention and deportation of individuals like those you have mentioned, those are very important issues for a lot of voters. But the difference is they will be reminded of the economy. We each really are reminded of our own economic situation and the country's economic situation, good, bad, or otherwise, whenever we fill our tank with gas or whenever we go and buy staples at the grocery, things like eggs and milk, right? And then when, Ohioans or Americans have saved up, for that purchase of that first home, or maybe for a family vacation, right? That's where Americans really get a daily reminder that economic conditions do impact each of us individually, and we're reminded of that every day in the purchases we either make or don't make as a result of economic conditions. So I do think we'll continue to see the economy is going to be the number one factor that's going to be predictive of how well the Republicans versus the Democrats do in terms of the midterm election, as well as the next presidential race.
Yeah, it's certainly all about the money for sure. Dr. Miller, I appreciate you for coming on Community Focus this week.
Thanks for having me, Jaden.